So thanks, Tony, and thanks for the invitation here. I have been coming to Seattle since 1988. You have built one of the great downtowns in the United States and frankly across the world, and the viaduct has not even come down yet, all right? And you need to think about this, the stat about 45% of your economic activity on 5% of your land mass. You are building a jobs base and a tax base that can help this city and this county survive and thrive in one of the most disruptive periods in the United States around the world. Everything has changed. Technology, economy, demographics, and crazy politics. The populists are basically in power. They're demagogues, they are exploiting real grievances, right? And every day we have to wake up to the latest tweet from our president. But there are structural changes at play in the world today that are diminishing the role of the nation state, right? The federal government at the end of the day is a health insurance company with an army, and it's elevating the role of the city-state. And the reason why cities matter is because what the market wants is agglomeration, co-location, concentration of universities and mature companies and startups and scale-ups. That's the innovation dividend. That creates a platform, as the mayor talked about, for economic opportunity for large segments of our population. Places like Seattle, and we saw this yesterday, Mary Jean Ryan and Tim Burgess took me on a tour of South City, South County. We see radical demographic change, really the renewal of this city, the replenishment of our democracy. And when cities grow the way you're growing, now basically augmented, catalyzed by transit with enormous growth in the core, that is what sustainable development is about. So cities are at the vanguard of economies. And what we're also seeing is they are where the power lies now. Power is drifting downwards in our country and particularly in Europe, from nation states and provinces and states to cities, county, and metropolitan areas. And it's moving horizontally across from the government, public, to public, private, civic, university, community, and so forth. This is what we call the new localism. And we think of this as a philosophy and practice for solving the hard challenges in the United States and across the world, whether these are economic challenges, whether they're social, and whether they're environmental. I mean, this is what's happening now. Problem solving is bottom up rather than top down. It is network driven rather than just purely government delivered. It is interdisciplinary rather than compartmentalized and specialized and highly bureaucratic. So if you're in a city world, what you need are norms. You need models. You need examples of cities that are cracking it on growth or governance and finance, so you can adapt and adopt it to your own place. And I want to tell you about 3 stories and how they're relevant to what Seattle now faces. So for growth, what we did is we went to Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is a gorgeous city, right? Absolutely beautiful at the confluence of several rivers. But this is what it basically looked like in the 1970s. If you went to Pittsburgh, as I did as a child, you literally could not breathe, right? When the steel industry collapsed, it lost tens of thousands of jobs literally overnight. Incredibly, if you read the book, the renewal of Pittsburgh started with the 3 Mile Island disaster, okay? Because as the companies, Westinghouse and Bechtel, tried to think through how to clean up the disaster, they couldn't quite figure out how to assess the damage. What they ultimately found was this guy sitting on top of some early robot, a brainiac named Red Whittaker from Carnegie Mellon. And Red Whittaker was basically at the forefront of creating mobile robots. You know, in the late 1970s, if you wanted to find a robot, you'd go to the Ford Motor Company plant and cars would move along and a robot would spray paint the car. These folks created mobile robots, and they sent these robots into the basement of 3 Mile Island to assess the damage and ultimately figure out how to clean up the mess. Now, essentially, what Pittsburgh did is it realized the new spatial geography of innovation. Red Worker was at Carnegie Mellon. If you fall out of Carnegie Mellon, you're in the University of Pittsburgh. If you fall out of the University of Pittsburgh, you're in the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. 30 years ago, if you wanted to find an innovation center, you get in your car in a downtown and you just drive until you found a corporate campus where people were keeping their secret secret. Today, this sort of special area of Pittsburgh, or what you have in portions of your region, is the magic mile, right? This is what how innovation happens. It happens because of proximity and density and authenticity and vibrancy and different parts of your ecosystem sharing ideas and creating products. Pittsburgh is at the forefront of 5 of maybe 12 or 15 next generation technologies that within a relatively short period of time will generate about half of global GDP. You are also at the vanguard of many of these and other technologies. The cities that are on the ground floor of this stuff are going to be very, very wealthy going forward. So Pittsburgh's a little bit of an it city, like you're in it city. It's attracting all these people from around the country and from around the world. But most importantly, it's attracting companies, tech companies from the United States and outside the United States who come to Pittsburgh because they need to be near the secret sauce. Talented faculty, talented students, talented people. So what you learn from a Pittsburgh is a city, particularly a city that had a crisis like Pittsburgh had, has to think like a system. You have to think across multiple dimensions. If you're talking about stewarding an economy, it's not just about companies. It's about advanced research. It's about centers of excellence. It's about community colleges. It's about skills. You have to think like a system, and you have to act like an entrepreneur. You need to take risks, public, private, civic. Pittsburgh has gone from being a rust belt to a brain belt. That's how you survive in the 21st century. But they've built on their historic legacy. They still make things in Pittsburgh. They just make different things than they have in the past. And the role of philanthropy in Pittsburgh, the role of R.K. Mellon, or the role of the Heinz Endowments, or the role of the Hillman Foundation, they invested in next generation technology. No one knew what autonomous vehicles were, or robotics was, or big data analytics, or machine learning 20, 30 years ago. But that's what the philanthropies were investing in. They knew they had to be the best at the next generation. So there are lessons from Pittsburgh. Indianapolis has other lessons, which in some respects might even be more relevant to what you're about to face. So if you went to Indianapolis in the mid-1970s, this is basically what you had happen. A bunch of folks would go down with shotguns to the downtown and shoot pigeons. It was like most downtowns, desolate, decentralized. Kurt Vonnegut, the great novelist, grew up in Indianapolis. He basically said it was a place for 364 days you played miniature golf, and on the 365th day you went to the Speedway. This was a boring place, right? So what they did, and some folks may just think of this as completely delusional, they decided to become the amateur sports capital of the world in the middle of the 1970s. And they built all these facilities in the core of the city to begin to bring people back to the center, because the downtowns really are the barometer and the heart. They also stole the Baltimore Colts. Did not go over well very much in Baltimore. And they actually stole the NCAA from Kansas City, right? So that's what Indianapolis was trying to be. It was trying to be the amateur sports capital of the world. At some point, they figured out that you need to get beyond essentially beer and hot dogs, right? I mean, how much consumption can you possibly have? So they took this old Indiana Sports Corporation, which was a network of public, private, civic, university leaders, and they began to move from basketball to biotech. They began to think about, if we're going to be a 21st century economy, we've got to build from innovation. We've got to build from advanced research. And they have great life science companies like Lilly and Roche Diagnostics and others. They created something called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. Okay, this is a group of 60 CEOs, corporations, universities, and philanthropies, and they began to basically tease out, with evidence, a bunch of sectoral moves. You know, Indianapolis are very good at life sciences. They're the second biggest exporter of life science products in the United States after California. So they do a lot of trade, they do a lot of logistics, And this group of CEOs basically said, we've got to be the best 21st century version of ourselves. And we can't rely just on government, because in Indiana, the state government really doesn't do that much. I'm not sure how Mike Pence became vice president, separate story. But they began to aggregate private and civic capital to invest in companies and invest in advanced research. And then, just as they stole football teams and the NCAA, steal star faculty from all over the world to come to Indianapolis, right? This is private and civic capital that has been aggregated to steer and steward an economy. So in Indianapolis, what they talk about, even though the quote's from the mayor of West Sacramento, is we want to be an ecosystem, not an ecosystem, right? We want to basically practice the rules of the sandbox. We need to play well together and design and then execute on vision. And what they've perfected, and this is really important to think about for Seattle, they have perfected the mechanics of collaboration. When these CEOs meet, backed by capital, they meet to decide, not to discuss. The Seattle way is a bit about consensus to the point of exhaustion, right? Eventually you do something, but it's usually after everyone has just collapsed, right? And in Indianapolis, they meet every quarter and they make investments together. Now, they make investments in the economy. Think of getting together and making investments around homelessness or housing or a range of other issues. It doesn't matter what the topic is. They operate at multiple geographies. It's the downtown, it's the district, it's the innovation district, it's the city, it's the metropolis, it's the region. These folks are thinking about different scales of geography and how they matter to the economy. And then they organize private and civic wealth. This is the wealthiest country in the world by far, with a lot of capital that's sitting on the sidelines. In Indianapolis, that capital is harnessed and comes together to basically make transformative investments. Last story, we'll go to Copenhagen, Denmark. This is not about cycling, okay? This is about the secret of Copenhagen. Now, Copenhagen is actually similar to your size, about 600,000 people in the city, 2 million people in the metro. People are obsessed with cycling, obviously. But 30 years ago, this city was flat on its back, 18% unemployment, basically fiscally bankrupt. The national government and it's hard to believe that a national government would ever sit and actually do something constructive with their mayors, but their national government sat with the mayor of Copenhagen and said, we have to do something big. We've got to invest in a citywide subway system that will set basically the platform for the regeneration of the core of our city. The only problem is they couldn't raise taxes. It is Denmark, right? Everyone's pretty taxed already. So they figured out a way to take all the land that the government owned, the national government, the local government, owned between the downtown and the airport and along their old harbor, and they transferred all this land to something called the City and Port Development Corporation, right? So all this land, the North Harbor, the Orestad District, we're talking about several square miles of land that was owned by the government, transferred to a publicly owned, privately driven corporation. And the only rule that was given to this corporation, the only requirement, is the yield from land sales and from land leases would service the debt on a citywide transit system. So if you go to Copenhagen today, they have built one of the great subway systems in the world without a kroner of taxes, right? It is all from the yield of land sales and land leases, right? Public assets, public wealth. So they're not there for the quick fix. In the United States, think what we do when the government realizes they own something. It's usually in the middle of an annual deficit, and they go, we better sell it. Get the best price right now, and if their value appreciates over time, whatever. But we need to basically meet our annual budget. They're not there for the quick fix. They're there for the long haul. And essentially, compared to the United States, government, all kinds of government, national, local, authorities, they know what they own. In the US, we tend to know what government owes, not what it owns. They know the value of what it owns. And then they're able to dispose of it and use the yield and the revenue in very constructive ways. They've actually merged public entities, and they've come up with this very interesting public-private management model, right? In the US, we tend to like for the public to manage certain things or the private to manage certain things. They've blended this in Denmark, they've blended this in Germany, they've blended this in Finland. We're gonna have to bring this model into the United States because this is the way you unlock public wealth, just like Indianapolis organized private and civic wealth. So how do you build a nation of problem solvers? And most importantly, what do you all do in Seattle to build from a very critical, prosperous, incredible platform that you've built over many years, right? How do you begin when the national government, like Elvis, has left the building? So there's been a memo that's been sent out from Washington, D.C., you're in charge, okay? We're playing games in Washington, right? Or, I won't say much about Olympia, but there are similar trends underway in many of our state capitals. The challenge we have is for every Pittsburgh, we have basically dozens of cities that invest in consumption rather than innovation. What Pittsburgh knew is they had to build centers of excellence in their research universities that then would undergird the growth and evolution of companies. For every Indianapolis, we've got great collaboration in the United States. We do collaborate to compete, but most of it's informal, it's undercapitalized, it's not really well organized. So we're not really bringing in this wealth and capital from the private and civic sectors and focusing on tasks and solutions. And for every Copenhagen, the reality in the US is government, because we have so much government, we love government because we have so much of it, government doesn't quite understand what it owns. And it doesn't understand how a smart disposition strategy over multiple decades could enable the public sector to reckon and participate in the run-up of value and then take that run-up of value and invest in what matters, right? Young children, infrastructure, entrepreneurial companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a little bit of work to do here. Here's the bottom line for every city in the US, because we are on our own, right? The good news is power belongs to the problem solvers. The hard news is every city and metropolis is basically on their own to figure out their future and to fund the future. So what's your edge? I think Seattle has a pretty good sense of what your edge is in the global economy, right? There are a whole bunch of reasons, some that were predictable, some that were just fortuitous and accidental. You find yourself at the heart of the global economy. The second question is who's in charge? That's a harder question because we tend to think at times, well, the public's in charge, the public sector, the elected officials in charge, and they absolutely are in charge. But when we're talking about 21st century challenges, I don't care if they're social, like housing or homelessness or opioids. I don't care if they're environmental, the climate crisis. I don't care if it's economic. The bottom line is the only solutions are going to come from interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral groups, right, which requires a different kind of organizing. And the third piece is where's your power? Do you have entities that are acting across sectors, that are acting across disciplines, that are harnessing private and civic wealth, that are unlocking public wealth, and then dedicating that to basically coming up and then funding and financing solutions for the 21st century? I think Seattle, like a lot of our West Coast cities and many of our East Coast cities, and you'll see a lot of the examples in the book are from the heartland where we had crises, I don't think you really have figured out a way how to aggregate your wealth. You have unbelievable wealth here. And the wealth tends to invest as it decides to invest, in philanthropy at times, or in market-oriented activities at other times. But it's not really coming together for the 2 + 2 = 5 effect. And going forward, because we cannot rely on the national government anymore, and the states also are going to be primarily financing the past because of our demographic transformation, we're going to have to figure out new kinds of entities that come together, maybe borrowed and adapted from Pittsburgh and Indianapolis and Copenhagen, or maybe just invented here. But we're going to have to figure out 21st century governance that is multi-sectoral and is multidisciplinary. So this is the challenge we have, right? And because you are so wealthy, you may be at the vanguard of new localism going forward, but you're going to have to be intentional and purposeful about it. You're going to have to rethink how you organize yourself, and you're going to have to prioritize which challenge are you going to solve, when, and with whom, right? So this is not just celebratory, hey, cities are in charge, life is great. This is about harnessing the possibilities of the 21st century and making this incredible place truly work for your broad citizenry and truly provide a platform for inclusive, sustainable, and innovative growth going forward. Thank you very much. Buy the book, see the movie. I'll be played by Brad Pitt, maybe, who knows. But most importantly, get done.